My name is Jack McDougall, and I'm the President and CEO of the Greater Washington Board of Trade. You know, our region is continuing to reopen, and we're preparing for and contemplating phase 3. You know, still many of us are anxiously, waiting and wondering. There are volumes of questions out there right now about how do we grapple with all the uncertainties? You know, what should we expect? How's all this going to work and continue to work? What's the timing? Are our customers going to return? And a whole host of other questions as well. And so fortunately for us, we can learn from the experiences in other countries around the world that are already navigating the post-pandemic world. And so today we're going to get a firsthand look at what's happening on the ground in China. China gets an awful lot of attention in the news, but what's really going on? Let's check that out a little bit. So we're going to hear from some of the people directly involved there. We're very pleased to welcome our guests today. Al Hankins, Manager of Procurement and Contracts at Bechtel. James Shepard, Head of Research, Greater China and Cushman and Wakefield. Jeff Astle, Managing Director of APCO Shanghai. And our moderator today is James Robinson, Global Lead Geo-Commerce at APCO Worldwide. James, currently based in New York, has 20 years of diverse international experience, communications, corporate affairs, sustainability, trade, policy issues. Most relevant to our discussion today, he was previously director of APCO's Shanghai business. He led a team of approximately 30 people and helped organizations develop their China strategies, navigate the complex government and regulatory environments in China, and manage public perceptions and reputational issues there. If you have any questions during our conversation, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will record this session and post to our website later this week. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to James, who will share some brief remarks, and then he will introduce today's guests. So with that, James, thank you so much.
Jack, well, thank you very much, and welcome to our panelists and the participants who are choosing to join today's important discussion. As you said, today we're looking to explore the future for the Greater Washington region and really use the perspectives that our colleagues on the line today have gathered from China and elsewhere around the world as they've been looking to bring their own employees and back to work and serve customers again. But before we start out, I just wanted to make a special thanks to Jack and Najia and Lindsay for organizing this discussion. It's a real privilege to be part of this and with such a good group of people. So just a couple of additional words about my background. As Jack said, I'm James Robinson, and I'll be your moderator today. I work for APCO Worldwide. APCO is an advisory and advocacy communications firm that's very proudly headquartered in Washington, D.C. But we have about 800 people working across 30 offices globally and including in China. And so while I'm sitting in New York today and I lead APCO's corporate advisory group, I've spent about 10 years of my career in China working with clients and frankly on the front lines of the crisis since it emerged earlier this year. So before I introduce the panel and we asked them to make some introductory remarks, I wanted to share a couple of slides. So in service of our work with clients, since the start of the pandemic, APCO has been conducting almost weekly opinion polling, which has revealed dozens of insights about how consumers, employees, investors, and others are feeling as they navigate this situation. About 2 weeks ago, we launched something called the Reset Indicator, which is a device that is looking to track our emergence into a new normal, and specifically looking at how Americans see themselves today, who supported them during the pandemic, and how they feel about the future. So this is just a snapshot of some of the data that we've collected. Again, this was done about 2 weeks ago. But a couple of observations. So firstly, Americans believe we are still very much in the grip of the pandemic, or that the pandemic will reemerge in the coming months. And I suspect this is only being hardened as we see the caseload spike at a rate of 20 to 30% increase on a 2-week rolling average in certain states. Secondly, Americans, I think, have a really mixed assessment about who's helping them emerge from this crisis. And the right-hand bar here gives us some terrific insights. Firstly, that the federal government is really not doing enough. At the bottom of that right-hand column, 53% of Americans believe that the US federal government is not performing adequately. And I think this is important when we start talking about China, where frankly, government has been very much in control and doing a lot to get the economy back and running. Whereas there is a greater degree of optimism in the role of state government, with 50% believing the state government is doing enough. And equally optimism in people's own employers. And again, making this conversation particularly relevant today, that employers are seen as being really important in the return to normality. Secondly, the expectations of government are high, but generally there's pessimistic outlook. So Americans have really turned to government during the pandemic, and in particular state and local governments. I think 67% of Americans believe that their local government will be important in creating a safer and more prosperous world coming out of the pandemic. However, according to various measures as we just saw, federal government in particular is not seen as acting effectively. The right-hand chart, I think, reveals another interesting insight. Americans actually feel quite optimistic about their own personal situation as they look 3 months out, that their own mental health, their own financial outlook will improve over the next 3 months. But again, we see this sort of negative feeling about the role of government, the wider economy, where we see a higher degree of pessimism. So what does this all tell me? Well, firstly, the sort of atmospherics of fear are infecting people's outlook. And secondly, that people are really looking to their employers and their local authorities as harbors of certainty as we come out of the crisis. And that sort of leads me to our panel today. And I'd like to just take a couple of additional minutes to introduce our panelists. So we're very lucky to be joined by Al Hawkins, who's based in Northern Virginia. And Al leads procurements and contracts for Bechtel, with responsibility for all supply chain operations across Bechtel's global business. As you probably know, Bechtel is a global leader in engineering and infrastructure and operates in 160 countries, employing 38,000 people and with revenues of $25 billion. So Al brings great experience over a career of work ranging from Australia to Angola. And I think we're very lucky to have his perspectives today. Next, James Shepard, who leads research for Greater China for Cushman and Wakefield, a real estate consultancy, and is based in Shanghai, but I understand today is calling in from the west coast of Scotland. He brings 20 years of experience in the Greater China real estate industry and leads a team of 80 professionals spanning North and South Asia, Australia, and New Zealand. He serves on the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, China Board, and really brings pretty unique insights into the properties and facilities sector. And then finally, my colleague Jeff Astle, who leads APCO's office in Shanghai, working with a number of Fortune 1000 companies on their China strategy and engagement. And Jeff formerly led the China-Britain Business Council and has really terrific insights into how businesses are responding to the crisis. He began his career in the media industry, and he's also a chartered management accountant and chartered marketeer. So as we turn to our panelists, I just wanted to give one sort of caveat or health warning for this conversation. Clearly, the US is a very different place from China. Unlike the US, the Chinese government has a high degree of authority and control over how society is conducted. The use of technology platforms like WeChat and Alibaba, Alipay are far more pervasive in China than in the US, allowing, again, government insights and control in a way that perhaps we don't have here. And obviously the flow of information is far more controlled in China, allowing for information to be used as a tool for recovery. So with that health warning, I want to move to our panelists and start by asking each of you to quickly share with us all one or two stories about your company's experience in China during the pandemic, and to particularly focus on what your business has been doing to adjust in the period of post-lockdown, and what you've learned coming out of the height of the pandemic. And I'm going to start with my colleague Jeff. Jeff, what's APCO been doing, and are there any particularly innovative or interesting observations you've had from your client work in China? Jeff, you're on mute.
Hi, James. Hi, everybody, and thank you for this opportunity. It's reflecting back on the last few months, it's been quite a surreal experience. I know that you're all now going through something similar. From the start, it seemed that we would not be able to function. And after 2 or 3 weeks of the lockdown, what really struck me was how adaptable and flexible people can be in terms of their working style, and how resilient our people are in terms of managing the change. And within a few weeks, we found that through the use of Zoom, through the use of social media platforms like WeChat in China, we were able to go about our work fairly well. I think the only challenges are really in terms of the opportunities to have real face-to-face contact with some of our clients, and particularly I think the impact on that we face on sort of our business development, because there really wasn't the opportunities to do that in the same ways that we were used to. As the first couple of months were, so this is sort of February and March over here, were a case where, as James alluded to, I mean, China locked down completely with very strong controls. And therefore, there wasn't really anything we do outside of the office. And I think when we started to return, we returned very slowly. We returned in steps and stages, in rotation of staff, and getting back to normal took quite a long time. Sort of weaning yourself back into the working environment, the office environment, the team environment. And it is only really now, after about 2 months of doing that, that we start to feel that we're in this new normal environment. That we're, in fact, over the last few weeks, I've sort of experienced a large client meeting where we sat down with 20 people in a room face to face for the first time about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And then just today, I went on my first business trip by car, 1.5 hours out of Shanghai, to a conference where there was 150 people. And nobody was wearing masks. We were all shaking hands and doing sort of normal, as much as you could, normal kind of business. Now, we were checked on the way in. We all had to download an application to give information about ourselves, to make sure that we were healthy. Our temperatures were checked. There was hand wash gel on every desk, and that was sort of compulsory. But it does feel like we're in this sort of a sort of new normal of getting back to things. So what I can promise is that we do readjust back to a working environment. What will change, I think, is our use of technology in particular, where we've really, I think, adapted to leveraging the powers of platforms like WeChat here in China and platforms like Zoom to really enable us to be much more dynamic and engaging with our teams and engaging with our clients in new ways. Back to you, James.
That's great, Jeff. Thank you. And now I wanted to turn to James. And James, for Cushman and Wakefield, what have you been doing to sort of safely and efficiently bring your people out of lockdown, out of quarantine, and get them back into the workplace? And what are you seeing through your research? Are there any early indicators about how sort of cities or workplaces of the future might look after the pandemic?
Thanks, James, and really want to echo a lot of the content there that Jeff shared. COVID-19 for us really took a hold during the Chinese New Year holiday, and everyone was out of the office anyway in most cases. Initially, we started back in batches of staff that were essential to operations. So we started off with, say, property managers, facility managers, office administration staff. Whereas all other staff were typically encouraged to work remotely where that was possible. In Shanghai, restrictions were somewhat less severe than other cities. Office buildings had limits on the numbers of staff that could access the office building at any given time. Central air conditioning systems were not running. Cleaning protocols were sort of checked and where appropriate enhanced. Gradually, our staff started to return to their offices, starting with a maximum 50% capacity. Upgraded filters and HVAC systems were cleaned before being recommissioned. Staff at that point then, obviously still sort of restaurants were closed, so staff were able to receive food delivery at meal times with drop-off locations outside the building. And as time went on and the threat reduced, more staff started to return on a voluntary basis. But very quickly, this led to the vast majority of staff being back in the office. We provided more frequent and deeper cleaning, PPE and hand sanitizer. We communicated very closely with them. I think that's one of the key learnings really, is making it very clear that this is a safe environment and that they should be confident to return to work. One of the interesting things, of course, China is a huge place. Each office across China had a very different approach to the reopening, depending on the local situation and the severity of the outbreak and the government lockdown measures that were in place in that location. But to be honest, I mean, I would say it was incredibly smooth. Blink and you would miss it in many cases. By April 14th, according to the government figures, the return to work rate of large and medium-sized companies was around 99%. So that's very, very quick. There's still some restrictions and of course in place and protocols, but our company maintains a very flexible and understanding position. Just in terms of what's still in place, sort of commuting and using public transportation, our company is quite flexible in terms of people choosing to travel on off-peak periods just to make them more comfortable. When arriving at work, body temperatures are checked at the entrance of the office building and in our office workplace lobby. Masks are generally still worn when outside the home and at work. Of course, hand washing is done more frequently. Meetings tend to be restricted. This can be sort of a corporate policy, not necessarily a government policy. The number of people that you might choose to have a meeting would typically be reduced. Client meetings were generally done virtually during the most challenging period, but actually now these are largely face-to-face, these meetings. A lot of upgrading of systems in HVAC, interest in improving the quality of the environment. So pretty much everything else is remaining somewhat normal and very little in the way of social distancing. From our research perspective, so looking at the office market, for example, net absorption dipped into negative territory in Q1. I think, of course, China's really at the forefront here in terms of feeling the impact. And that was the first time that we'd seen negative absorption of office premises in China since the global financial crisis.
James, tell us what net absorption means, just for those who maybe
the amount of space. So our businesses continuing to absorb more space than they had taken on previously. So companies were generally continuing to grow, or new companies were coming into the market in that scenario. There was some remaining pockets of demand during that period of time, but that was very heavily weighted to technology, not surprisingly, given the need for technology. Media, telecommunications, healthcare, finance, insurance, and retail sectors were typically still very active, but only where they had a strong online presence. So many of the retailers that hadn't prepared that sort of online presence were very hard hit, and some of them didn't make it. As business ramps up once again and construction resumes across China, the lockdown is going to have a major impact on the amount of real estate that's being built, and it's going to restrict the number of options that many of the tenants are going to have over the next few years. In China, the residential sector is typically the safe haven for many of the developers. So that many of the developers can generate quick cash flow by developing residential property. So they've shied away from the commercial environment, which is a bit more challenging. Many of the projects being mothballed. So the companies are going to have to take a very close look at their strategies going forward to make sure that they're able to take advantage of, I think, the current challenging period for developers, but potentially a shortened or reduced supply in the future. People are now getting back en masse, and we anticipate we're already seeing some fairly strong, I would say, pent-up demand for Q2, a bit more modest than previous years. But the economic uncertainty has definitely stimulated some consolidation of business units to under one roof to generate cost savings, and also potentially to sort of decentralized areas. We're seeing a bit more demand in lower cost locations. We haven't necessarily seen the occupiers reweighting to remote working strategies en masse. But I think that is certainly a threat for many of the developers. So this is giving those occupiers, they're calling the shots in the negotiations in many cases at the current time. The incentives, of course, I think this will be the same in the US. The incentives became increasingly attractive, and some tenants were provided with sort of short rental holidays, but they were fairly brief. A couple of tenants closed down shop. We didn't see a huge en masse walkout of tenants or companies' bankruptcies, etc. But things tend to be coming back now. Wellness and well-being, of course, became very important, as were flexible working arrangements. And that really proved that the technology now is really quite robust. And I think in our case, we found that the workforce was extremely capable of managing their own time effectively and working remotely. And that's obviously fueling quite a bit of interest in exploring such trends in the future. So just echoing what Jeff's saying, I think we're going to see a lot more of this in the future. As companies permit more of that flexible sort of working, I think this will undoubtedly lead to a reduction of the amount of real estate seating that they may need. But as businesses are also now acutely aware of the value of social distancing and the value of having space in our office environments, space per person, we'll likely see that increase. So we think these two trends are generally going to cancel each other out. But things happen so quickly in China that really there wasn't a lot of social distancing measure in terms of restacking office environments, because everyone was back to work very quickly, and then the threat reduced very quickly. I don't think that's going to be necessarily the same in many other markets where we're having to learn to live with COVID over a longer period of time, where we'll actually have to make many more changes. But I do think in the China example that we're seeing that working itself into future plans for offices going forward.
James, thank you. A lot that I'd love to dig into further with you and Will in a moment. But before that, Al, you have a very different vantage point sitting at a corporate headquarters back in the US. I wonder if you could perhaps talk about some of the things that Bechtel has been doing to sort of maintain business continuity through the pandemic, whether in China or other global markets, and how have you sort of safely ramped back up projects that may have slowed down during the peak of the pandemic, and other lessons to be learned from overseas that might be useful to those of us sitting here in the US?
Yes, thank you for having me. Happy to share some of that. I'd like to start off by saying, because we are a global engineering and construction company, the mix of our people consists of not only just people in an office environment, but lots of people in a construction setting, boots on the ground, moving dirt, materials, heavy equipment. And so because the effects of COVID-19 were first felt in Asia with our operations in Shanghai and Taiwan, and we also have a small office in Beijing, our first priority was to make sure that our people on the ground in Asia knew that we, first of all, were most concerned about their health and well-being. So one of the first things we did was to make sure that they had proper mask and sanitizer and the things that they viewed as essential, because at some point in China, those things were in short supply. And so early on at the very beginning of the year, and actually maybe towards the end of last year, we actually made sure that we had enough supplies of the right kinds of things to make sure our people were safe on the ground. Number two, and I'd like to echo the sentiment of some of the other panelists, we did a lot of the same things. But I think what's really important is someone mentioned earlier, resiliency. The resilience of our people, I think, is phenomenal. You know, during World War II, they had that motivational poster that said, "Keep calm and carry on." Well, we tried to instill with our folks to definitely remain calm. And for business continuity, what we thought was of absolute importance was to have daily communications. We had a COVID-19 crisis management team at the corporate level, at the regional level, and sometimes at the local level. And it was a coordinated effort, and every single day we gave information and instruction, and we received input and information. So it was a two-way exchange, and so we could respond adequately. And those communications, especially in the very early days, were critical and I think greatly appreciated. Now, the other thing that I think needs to be mentioned, not everybody could work from home, right? And some of the places where we operate, people come into the office, they have a computer, they have connectivity, they have Wi-Fi, and not everybody's home environment was conducive for that. So we really had to harness our IT and systems people to coordinate with everyone, not only in Asia, but other locations around the world, to make sure that the IT systems were secure and that people, if they were working from home or some location outside of the office, they actually could connect into the system, and that was of utmost importance. And so we did spend a lot of time focusing on coordinating that effort. I think also, like a lot of companies, when you look at COVID-19, and especially Asia, it was really a kind of a combination of a lot of factors, kind of the perfect storm, right? Because pre-COVID-19, we were dealing with a lot of tariffs and quota restrictions as far as goods and materials coming out of Asia. Then we had COVID-19, and also we had the collapse of the oil and gas market. So all of those things all at once created an environment unlike what we had seen historically ever before. And so we spent a lot of time looking at our operations, kind of right sizing. Do we need to do something different? Fortunately for a company like Bechtel, you know, it's debt free, so we don't have any loans, and it's a privately held company, so we don't have public shareholders. So we could be more nimble, and we could implement the operations that we thought were appropriate to respond to the crisis that was going on. But I think, again, first and foremost, we made sure our people knew that even though you were miles away, we were watching out for you. We were getting them the essential materials that they needed. Now, once we started to have folks come back to the office, a lot of the things that were mentioned, extra cleaning in the office facilities, making sure that wash stations and hand sanitizers and things of that nature were prevalent everywhere in the office. But when you also think about what about our people on the ground and in supplier shops and that kind of thing, the construction industry, no surprise to anyone, is heavily dependent on schedules, right? And we coordinate certain trades to do certain construction activities. And with the social distancing, the challenges at a construction site are far greater than what they are in an office environment. And we had different reactions. Some customers said, hey, yep, absolutely, social distancing, and they slowed down. And some said, no, just keep things going the way they are. And some said, no, for some of these huge projects, we actually do have to shut down. And I think one of the things that worked for us is being able to listen to our customers, to also accommodate whatever their preference was. And so overarching all of this, I think the way you get through it, relationships become really, really important. Those relationships with your customers and suppliers and other contractors that help you carry out your business, because you have to instill a sense of we're all going through this together and we're all going to get through it together. So.
Al, thank you. And that's actually a great segue. I wanted to talk a little bit about business continuity, and I won't ask you specifically whether you've had to furlough staff or reduce headcount, but in the relationships that you have with customers and vendors, to what extent have there been headcount reductions, and to what extent are those continuing post pandemic, or are you seeing a resurgence in hiring? And a sort of part two to that question is, The Economist sort of came up with the term the 90% economy, the fact that the economy, until there's a vaccine or cure, will not be able to sort of run as it was beforehand. Is that something that you're seeing in China? And I wanted to direct this first to James and Jeff, and then maybe come back to Al. To what extent is the economy operating at 100%, or is it 90 or even less? And maybe Jeff, you want to go first?
Yeah, I think to answer the first question, I think sector by sector we're seeing, and James alluded to this earlier, significant differences. There are sectors that are actually growing through this. Certain areas of technology, obviously healthcare, those that are very strongly into online platforms or e-commerce solutions, have really come out of this quite strong. And then others, they've had to manage furloughing staff, or sort of managing staff in terms of many hours they've got. In our sector, we saw a slowdown, and also our clients, in terms of the work that they're asking us to do, I think it's become a little bit more short term. So some of the sort of strategic engagement work that we were doing with firms that may be looking at trying to influence policy in China or reposition themselves for a longer term, I think they're now looking much more at a short-term priorities, whether it's around sort of crisis, or whether it's around local government engagement, or what's come up a lot is employee engagement and making sure that staff feel engaged and sort of belonging to the firm. So I think there's been a sort of a slightly more short-term mindset. Your question about 90%, yeah, for sure. And I would probably put it slightly lower than that. I would say, we're operating at between 70 and 90%. In most, whether it's a shop or a restaurant, all the way through. Certain sectors, clearly travel, leisure, entertainment, much lower than that. But overall, I would put it sort of in the 70 to 90% levels of capacity and productivity at the moment.
And James, how about for you and your clients?
Well, very similar to that, I would say we haven't had to do any sort of major furloughing, etc. And I think most of our clients are really adopting a sort of wait and see attitude at the current time, where they're able to, where it comes up to sort of transactions where they're looking to renew their lease or relocate. If there's an opportunity for them to postpone that and delay that at all, then of course they're taking that. And I think that there's a fair amount of caution. But bear in mind, I think towards the end of last year, the financial, global economic outlook, was a fairly, how would I put it? It was a lot of companies weren't super optimistic. So there was quite a bit of, I think, cutting back and sort of rationalizing that went on then. And those that experienced, and particularly in the market like Hong Kong, those that have experienced financial downturns in the past know that these are often over very, very quickly. I was actually working at an accounting firm during the last global financial crisis in Shanghai, and I was testing valuations for audit purposes, and I couldn't actually prove that property prices had dropped during that period of time, just purely because there was so much stimulus going into the market. There was no fire sales going on, and you know, China sort of feathered its way through that last crisis. And I think there's huge degree of optimism that China would come back from this very, very quickly. And I think from a business perspective, we're in a fortunate position because, of course, we're coming out of this first. We're seeing the sort of rebound already. Yes, we're not at 100% capacity as yet, but it's definitely going in that direction. Some of the developers, it's very interesting. I was looking at the, we talked about net absorption earlier of office premises across Shanghai. Well, actually, Shanghai was the hardest hit across Asia Pacific. They had negative absorption in Q1 of around about 80,000 square meters. That's like a huge office tower vacated overnight. And we looked into where this was happening. It was actually happening in buildings where the landlords hadn't really cared what sort of tenant was in the building, just lease it to whoever would pay the highest rent. And of course, those companies, the ones that immediately sort of evaporated as the economic challenges started to hit. And so one or two buildings come sort of cleared out, whereas all the other developments still seem to be fairly stable, although they're having to offer some sort of rental discounts, certainly for a short period of time.
It's sort of sweeping out of actors that maybe were sort of vulnerable anyway.
On the ropes, yeah.
Yeah. And James, just to stick with you for a second, I mean, one of the pervasive narratives in the US is the potential decline in residential property prices within big cities, and the sort of boom that people are expecting in suburbs or out of town locations powered by technology. Is that something that you're seeing in China? Can you talk maybe a little bit about how you're seeing the sort of shifting valuations and prices of different types of real estate?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. So your audience may be familiar with the fact that China has been sort of clamping down on debt over the last couple of years, trying to get control of the debt situation, and particularly to the real estate sector. And what was real interesting then was what happened when they clamped down on debt to the real estate sector. Suddenly we saw a spike in residential property development. And that was actually driven by the fact that the developers were shifting their money away from commercial development, and they needed something that would generate rapid cash flow. And of course, well, residential property tends to do that better, and they understand that sector a bit better. Of course, they then need to get this supply to market, but there's huge demand still out there in China. Prices are very high, but slight discounts do tend to attract a lot of buyers in. So we haven't en masse seen any major, obviously each city and even just different district is different, but in general we haven't seen a massive amount of price discounting. I think perhaps more people had more time to study the opportunities out there in the market, and there's a lot of restrictions on the market at the moment, so it's very easy for the government to lift a few of those restrictions and stimulate demand. A lot of people have a fair amount of equity built up in their properties, so there's no sort of real fire sale going on. There's no sort of forced sale, or very few sort of forced sale situations. So we haven't really seen big price discounting.
Right, thank you. Al, turning to a slightly different topic, I mean, one of the enduring features of this pandemic, and as we saw here in the US yesterday with the president's decree on immigration, are these immigration restrictions, and certainly getting in and out of China, or frankly any country globally, is quite difficult. And as a global business, I imagine you have expertise, engineers, etc., who would need to be traveling between markets in order to frankly, fuel your infrastructure projects. How have you been handling that, and have you come up with any workarounds, seen anything in China or elsewhere that might be valuable to all of us on the phone?
Yeah, thanks. I think it has been a challenge because when you think about a global operation, each country has its own immigration restrictions. And in response to COVID-19, there were countries that completely shut down. There were countries that partially shut down. And there were some countries that didn't shut down too much later. And so our entire population, we had to assess, okay, what was essential travel versus, travel that wasn't essential and could be done utilizing technology. We found, of course, we all shifted to a lot more video conferencing and Zoom meetings and those kinds of things. But even the technology, we had inspectors that used to go into supplier shops to do supplier quality checks, and we were able to utilize the technology such that the inspectors didn't have to physically be there, but they could do just as thorough an inspection. And so we've been very fluid because, again, the geography is so different. We did have some people, just practical, from a real, being honest and realistic, that were scheduled to maybe leave one location or country, but they had to remain there because the country wasn't letting anybody in or out. And so we had to kind of look at some of those places on a case-by-case basis, but the main thing was to stay flexible, stay fluid, and make sure that our HR staff reached out to anyone who was perhaps on lockdown in a particular place or isolated, that the company had not forgotten about them, and that we were working to ensure that we could assist those people individually with their own situations. When you mentioned, go ahead.
I was going to ask a sort of supplementary point.
Yeah.
You lead procurement, and I imagine part of that is getting materials, components from one place to another. To what extent have you been? Has that operation been affected by the sort of restrictions?
Yeah, interesting, because the dust is still settling, right? By no means do we perceive that we've come out on the other side yet. So, but one thing that was noticed right up front, a lot of key suppliers would send notice letters saying, look, this is an event, it's impacting us, we're not sure to what extent, but they basically were putting us on notice that there could be an impact to their deliveries, an impact to their ability to comply with the purchase order transactions. And in our supply chain, we do services as well as material and equipment. We do it all. And so we got a lot of those early notifications, but what in effect has in reality has come to fruition is a lot of those suppliers and contractors we work with, some joint venture partners, the impact was not nearly as severe as they thought it would be, and that's a good thing. So I think we're just, I guess, happy and glad that the impact wasn't as adverse as what people initially thought. And we're optimistic that going forward, we still made our major shipments and deliveries of materials and equipment. We still honored those service agreements that we have in place worldwide. But everybody's on hey, we're monitoring it, we're watching it, and are going to see just how it all plays out at the very end.
Yeah, I mean, it feels from where I'm sitting that there is this sort of grand renegotiation happening all over the place. James, you talked about sort of rent holidays. Obviously, government has stepped in some places, but and part of my guess is part of sort of weeding out the bad actors is who is that relationship that you can trust, and that's going to be your sort of friend through the pandemic, and hopefully come out the other side as an even stronger partner.
Yeah. And another interesting development, and it may affect the commercial real estate area, because our landlord in Shanghai actually approached us and offered to give us some incentive to adjust the office footprint and actually have a smaller footprint where we pay less. And for us, this whole COVID-19 has been an enormous experiment in working from home. The demand to be in the office was very prevalent, very common, very strong within our company. And now, having gone through what we've gone through, we realize there are lots of folks who can work from home and be effective and productive. And people are rethinking, maybe we don't need as much space at a physical location as we thought we did. So that's going to be a kind of the new normal, I think, for companies like ours.
Right. Jeff, I wanted to throw a question to you, and this relates to the sort of reemergence of the virus in Beijing, and to what extent does that shake the kind of trust that you described at the outset of the call, the willingness of people to shake hands, to be in meetings? Is this going to be a game of whack-a-mole over the next sort of year, or how long it takes for us to find a vaccine? And what does that mean for folks frankly outside of Beijing, but in Shanghai or other locations that haven't seen the resurgence at the moment? I'm sorry, that's to Jeff.
I mean, yeah, what's happened in Beijing? Sorry, what's happened in Beijing? Can you hear me, James?
Yes, you're just on a bit of a delay.
Can you hear me? Hello? Okay. What's happened in Beijing the last couple of weeks, I think, has been really interesting in district, local, city government to track everybody, to isolate everybody, to test everybody on a scale and speed which was super impressive and reassuring, I think, for people in the city. Our office was caught up in it in Beijing. We had one person in the office building that was a case, and then overnight the building was closed down. All of the people that had contact with that person were quarantined. The security cameras were checked to see where that person had gone on the days they'd been in the office, and we're all our teams now are having tests and are in quarantine. So the response has been huge. No one wants to be another Wuhan local government sort of slowly moving on this, and I think that's what I would also iterate in terms of what we've seen in China, is that the local government engagement with businesses has really ramped up. They're looking, and Al mentioned this earlier, they're looking at sort of how they can support you, how they can give you more greater flexibility, how they can help you through this crisis, and their responses to public safety and public well-being is now, you know, very, very impressive to see wherever you go in public locations. And so, though the fear is that there's going to be, as you say, sort of continuing waves of reappearance of this, and I wouldn't want to be overly optimistic. I think that could well be the case. But what we're seeing here is that the response by local government is very rapid. The ability to do contact tracing here is very sophisticated, and therefore the fear of that spreading more widely is sort of minimized. And human behaviors are, you know, we I said today we were at an event where people were mingling with some reservation, but were mingling similar to what we would have done pre-COVID. But obviously we would react immediately back to where we were a few months ago in terms of our behaviors very quickly if there was an outbreak recorded. But I think it has certainly heightened concerns that there's going to be another wave coming through China. But there's still a lot of confidence in government response.
Great. I mean, to that point, a question that came in from the audience. China is a very different place, and to what extent are there useful lessons coming out of China for the US? I mean, we don't have the kind of contact tracing capabilities, the ability of government to sort of lock down wide swathes of the population. Where does the comparison, the lessons from China, where are they helpful and where are they not so helpful? Maybe James, Al, Jeff, I'll open it up to all three of you.
Well, I think, you know, I think whoever asked the question is obviously, I think, absolutely correct. It is a very, very different situation. I would like to point to a couple of things. Of course, we've mentioned the contact tracing and the ability just to switch that on and get on with it without asking too many questions, which has had its huge benefits. I would say immediate lockdown, which perhaps is not so has not been so possible in other countries globally. But I think culture of wearing masks, people had masks on instantly, maybe to protect themselves initially, but the reality was, I think that was slowing the spread. So it's a very, very different set of circumstances that we're having to deal with in China at the current time. But there's still various different lessons. I think both Al and Jeff have mentioned the communications at length. And Al, I was very impressed by all of those measures that you've done. And I think absolutely right. You've got to make sure you get the communications right. The PPE make sure your staff are comfortable in the workplace. So I think that's a lesson. Maybe from a higher level, I was very impressed at the outset with the way China had dealt with leaving the border open. I think many countries worldwide could have learned many lessons from that. Unfortunately, I think as the pandemic sort of kicked off globally, we started to see the number of passengers coming into China that were COVID infected. I think that just overwhelmed the process. But basically, when you arrived in China, you were basically obviously temperature tested, etc. And if there'd been cases on your flight, I think it was, Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, 3 rows in front, 3 rows behind, all of those people would be put in quarantine into a hotel for 2 weeks, private transportation, etc. Okay, it was a bit clunky. It was hard work to get through the whole process. Many people were then sent home to quarantine at home. And again, maybe possible in China, people were monitored in their home environment and stayed there, and people obeyed the rules, which I think is maybe another issue some other countries struggle with, whereas people are not necessarily inclined to follow rules quite so closely. So ultimately, there were some huge advantages, but there are definitely things we can learn in terms of the way they had been quarantining people, keeping borders open. I think that's an important thing that a lot of countries still need to get their heads around. I think that if you look at some of those global reopening indexes, the trackers, China's pretty much open except for the border. So I think that's something that would make a big difference in other countries. I think they can give themselves a competitive advantage. Meanwhile, you can help your hotel industries, which are struggling, by enforcing quarantines in those hotels.
Good point. We have another question from the audience here about the sort of raising rhetoric in Washington and Brussels, some of it very legitimate, about disinformation coming out of Beijing about COVID-19. And this maybe is directed to Al, or someone sitting in Washington, D.C. Do you see sort of retaliatory measures either on the Chinese side or frankly on the US side that's going to have a direct impact on businesses sitting in the D.C. metro area? And I guess it goes beyond just the disinformation, but also potential additional trade issues.
Yes, thanks. I would have to say at this juncture, we've not seen any retaliatory measures manifest, but Washington is one of those kind of cities that's filled with kinds of theories, conspiracy ideas, and the like. But in reality, we have not seen it yet, and it's not had a direct adverse impact on us. So.
Great. Jeff, how about you? I mean, sitting in government relations, what's the temperature like in China?
Yeah, I mean, today I was with some sort of US government officials and also some local Chinese government officials in some meetings, and what I would and they differentiated between the kind of foreign affairs rhetoric, the sort of geopolitical rhetoric which is going on, and the more pragmatic commercial departments engagement on both sides, where there is a real understanding and realization that we need to find bilateral solutions, and still a very strong commitment to, though clearly it's going to be tough in terms of the phase 1 deal that was struck between the US and China to deliver in this environment, but a real commitment to that and to continue to support US firms in China, US firms investing in China, and vice versa. They're certainly from the Chinese side. There's the rhetoric, which is more of, as I say, the wolf warrior ambassadors around the world and the foreign affairs departments, and I think that's strong on both sides and will continue, certainly as we're in an election year. But there's a much more pragmatic, sort of business-oriented desire to keep the flow of goods and money going.
That's great. So, final question for you all. Understanding the realities, again, that the US and China are very, very different. I'm thinking the sort of next 12 months out. What would be one lesson that you think US businesses, or frankly policymakers, but I'd prefer to focus on businesses, could take from the China experience that will enable a return to a new normal as much as possible? And perhaps, Jeff, I can start with you.
Well, again, we had conversations about this with various businesses today. Actually see this as an opportunity. See this as an opportunity that you've probably gone through a critical period where you've really had to evaluate your strengths in the business in the business environment, and maybe look at your resources and work out where there's real need for certain resources or assets or business lines, and through that some pruning may need to be done. But this is a real opportunity to invest, to really set you apart in the future. So whether that's investing in sort of digitization, leveraging technology, digitization in your supply chains, investing in localization where you need to, or mitigating solutions, investing in your staff to upskill and give them more flexibility and adaptability, and looking at your assets and seeing how you're leveraging them, whether they need fine-tuning or adaptation or investment in. So this, I think there's a real opportunity here to see this as a chance through a crisis that becomes an opportunity. I think a real chance to improve efficiency, productivity, and customer value and business value. The other thing I'd say that's going to be a sort of a long-lasting legacy is the appreciation of value of employees at all levels of a firm, and we've seen that in sort of public sector appreciation of our sort of critical workers across the field, whether they're bus drivers or truck drivers or hospital workers. But I just think appreciation for our staff much more in terms of their well-being. We talked about health and well-being, but also I think their emotional and
Jeff,
psychological.
I'm going to interrupt you. Oh, I'm going to interrupt you just because we're running out of time, and quickly turn to Al and then to James. Just 30 seconds. If there was a sort of lesson, what would it be?
To remain flexible. I think most companies have had phased approaches, but like a lot of companies, we are also forecasting out through the end of 2021 fairly conservative cash flow estimates, and other financial transactions are forecasted at a very conservative rate, just because we don't know, but we are proceeding cautiously with those conservative forecasts.
Thank you, Al. And James.
Well, just picking up on what Jeff mentioned, I think future-proofing is key. You look at a lot of the trends that were accelerated very rapidly during this period of time. Remote working, technology for remote working, the challenges the retail sector perhaps was experiencing was accelerated really quickly. And those that hadn't those online retail presences, hadn't developed their remote working technology, those were the companies that got punished.
Terrific. Well, I want to thank the panelists. This is a really great conversation today. And to close this out, I want to turn back to Jack.
Well, that's great. Thanks, everybody. That was a really interesting conversation. Al, James, and Jeff, really appreciate your insights. Also appreciate you coming to us from 3 different continents. That's pretty amazing. So there are a lot of benefits to some of these virtual conversations that we're having now. James Robinson, thank you so much for facilitating today. It was really very well done and interesting. And so I appreciate you all taking the time. Again, this will be available on our website later this week. And everyone stay well and have a really great day. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.